Yeah, I was reading something this morning, and one of Venerable Chodron's Lamrim books about the dedication by Geshe Sopa, Lama Sopa, about the basic idea that the purpose of our life is not to be well liked by people, or to be rich or famous, or to live for a super long time. I don't know what people want, there's all these different things. Some of us are like more focused on other ones. Like some people might like to think that they could prove themselves to be the very best at something, even if it didn't involve getting rich. Like I could be the smartest one, or the best chess player, or the best karate doer, or something. And so, yeah, people have all this kind of diversity of life purposes to which they become attached. And I know some people, for example, who are very nice, and after a while, if you get to know them, you begin to think that that's how they've established their sense of purpose in life, is to be the nicest one. And no, seriously, right? I mean, maybe that's a little bit of, what do you say, like a way that is well intended but can go slightly awry, right? I will attain to nicesthood. Yeah. So, I mean, I just want to throw that in there as it's not, we don't dedicate ourselves to becoming the nicest person in the world, or the most polite person even. Right? So the purpose of life is to find ways to benefit all sentient beings. And then we learn that this becomes possible to extend to all sentient beings by cultivating compassion, but then one doesn't necessarily have any good skills to do it, to actually be helpful, unless you understand something about the basic nature of reality, which, through misunderstanding which, people are drawn into suffering. So I think that's, I don't know, how the logic of this works for me, that that it makes a lot of sense to me personally, that I feel a great sense of futility about most of the things that most of us chase after most of the time. Yeah. So I had some good conversations with people, and out of a couple of actually since the last session, and out of one of them, or two of them, arose a sort of sense that maybe instead of what I was planning to do next is sort of go into talking briefly about negative approaches to the ultimate reality in a non-Buddhist religion. I'm still going to, and then go into talking about the idea of Buddha as an ultimate knower or not knower, or which combination you want to pick. There's a menu of possibilities. And so I still want to get to that. And then beyond that, we're going to get to talking about practices that seem to involve some sort of not knowing or unknowing in Indo-Tibetan tradition. So that's still all out there. And then at the end, I was going to sort of look at what we can conclude from all this, or draw from it. But I think what I'm going to do now is move forward some of what I was going to talk about in terms of conclusions now, before we get into arguments about what the Buddha's mind is like, for example. Because it seems very practical and useful, and it connects to the question of what is Joan Halifax doing that could be useful to people. I guess it really rises existentially for me out of the sense that it was actually useful to me to read her book, but then the intellectual side of my brain doesn't fully understand why that would be. And so then this is all just including you in my process here. So I think from talking to some of you, have gotten a little bit of a handle on where I can go with that, and I wanted to talk about that first, and then we'll transition back to talking about approaches that are taken a negative route or an unknowing route in Christianity and so forth, and then we'll focus on the Indian and Tibetan stuff. So I was talking about how under the heading of darkness or not knowing. I've been calling it applied darkness, putting some kind of unknowing or not knowing to practical use to benefit people. That Roshi Joan is training all these hospice people in mindfulness meditation. And also she trains them in, I don't know, what do you call it? 4 immeasurables. So what do you call the 4 immeasurables? 4 immeasurables? Oh, I was thinking maybe you had a different word. Okay. Yeah. So, limitless love and compassion and equanimity extending out. She trains people in that as well. I didn't think to mention that before. And then she has very detailed meditations, guided meditations, helping people imagine their own death. Like, imagine you're going to die in a year. What would be really important? Imagine you're going to die next week. What would be really important? Imagine you're going to die the next hour. What would be really important, right? And get people to sort of gradually take more and more seriously that this is really going to happen. And you have to make sense out of your life in relationship to that fact, Nobody will, anyway. So the people who are doing this, some of them might be Buddhists, right? We don't know. Presumably nowadays, some of these doctors and nurses, I know that some of them are actually. There's Nancy. And then there's Frank Vivret, the oncologist in Pittsburgh, who's a Buddhist and so forth. But most of them aren't Buddhists who go to Santa Fe, to Upaya, to train with her. And so what are they doing? What are they trying to achieve with this mindfulness practice that she's teaching them? They're not trying to gain insight into the 3 marks, of the arising phenomena as suffering and impermanent in the sense of momentarily disintegrating and ultimately devoid of self. And thereby, having seen these marks, becoming free from cyclic existence, right? They're not doing that because they don't have that superstructure operating. They're trying to figure out how, in a much more unelaborated sense, to just be helpful to the people that they have to go back and start working with the next day. So how now, since they keep coming back and paying money and and then presumably actually benefiting people, they will posit, for the sake of argument, that they are actually gaining some benefit in that regard. But it's not the benefit that you would be expecting, if you're practicing mindfulness meditation as a Buddhist, or maybe it overlaps with it a big deal, but there's some difference. Okay, so say well, what is it that they're getting then? All right. And then how can we tie that back into how that relates to what you get out of the practice of mindfulness in Buddhism? That's where I want to go. So I thought about this in terms of basically 2 ideas. And one is that they're gaining a sense of emotional intelligence, an ability to understand themselves and the people around them, what they're feeling. And then in addition to that, they're gaining, so I'll come back to that and explain that. But then in addition, they may be gaining something else. So I've so far managed to not use the word intuition, but it's something like, which I've been purposely avoiding, because it's like a grab bag, right? It's sort of like just not knowing is intuition. It's like, oh yeah, X equals Y. What was that? So. But anyway, I'm thinking of something like intuition here as some sort of subtle conceptuality that arises on the basis of extensive training, but isn't grossly engaged with that training. Thank you to Venerable Tarva for helping me think that through. And I think so if I think about those 2 things, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit more detail, emotional intelligence, which will explain, and then this kind of, trained intuition, which allows us skillful responsiveness. So in terms of the first, emotional intelligence, John Kabat-Zinn, who has a big role, obviously, if you know, in the history of making mindfulness popular in the mental health world in the West, he introduces this book, Search Inside Yourself, by the Google guy, by talking about open-hearted presencing. So yeah, that's like presencing apparently is present to presence is apparently a verb, and that he also says in an embodied way. That is, you make yourself present as a human being with an open heart in relationship to another person. That's very different from what I was describing as the hospital mode, right, of like looking at each patient as a diagnosis code and a set of one thing to check off on a long list of obligations that the nurses have and are driven somewhat frantic by, right? Instead, there's a kind of like being there as a person with a person. And whenever I think about that kind of thing, that sort of presence with another human being, recognizing them as a human being, I don't know if you guys ever read I, Thou, but this is like a classic, right, by Buber, that just sort of always seems to come up when you're, in my mind. I don't know if you haven't read it, maybe it doesn't, but Buber, has this idea coming out of Jewish theology, basically, that the world is basically messed up when people look at things, other people as objects, and it becomes rich and beautiful when people actually regard one another as human beings and connect in a person-to-person way. For him, this relates to theology too, because of God being a person, and we can have a person. It ends up in a whole argument, against Buddhism in some sense, because what he's saying is that you have to have a personal ultimate reality in the end to have a person-to-person relationship with it. But on the ground, as far as what we can do with that idea, right, is that if we want to have a kind of skillfully compassionate connection with another person, right, it begins with sort of recognizing in a very fully present way they're not a sort of set of problems that's arise. This person has anger. What's on my checklist for dealing with anger? But there's an actual human being there with a particularly nuanced set of, what I'm saying, a very particular kind of anger that has a flavor and intensity that's unique to a specific situation, and you can't just go into the book. You have to be there as a person to respond. In terms of the emotional intelligence part, which is what I'm trying to focus on first here, people talk about this in Western psychology. They talk about it in terms of self-awareness and regulation on the one hand, and also empathy. So empathy is the part where we're connecting emotionally with the other person, and self-awareness means that we're understanding what's going on with ourself and can work with it. So working with our own emotional life and understanding that the other person has one too, to put it bluntly. This is I don't know. I've talked to some people in my Buddhism class, and I said, well, you just ask them, well, who do you think you are? These questions like, what do you take yourself to be, since you seem to think that you're, a continuously existent person? What do you think that is? And I've had a number of people who said that it's their feelings that is the real them. But those people are women who say that. And mostly the men, I haven't actually had a man to say, yes, I am my feelings yet. Interesting, right? But anyway, separate from that, I would say I know a lot of people who happen to mostly be men who actually don't have any idea what they feel about anything. They're just utterly unaware that they have emotions, which doesn't mean that they don't have them. It just means that these emotions are affecting their bodies and their minds and their behavior without them ever actually noticing what's going on. Yeah, so that's at the one extreme. Yeah. And so obviously, if you practice mindfulness meditation and you start out by watching your breath, then you can go into, once you get a little bit of mental stability, watching what is arising in your mind moment by moment, right? And it's like, I mean, probably all of us have done this, so you build a little microscope in your mental laboratory for watching experience closely, and then you see what comes in under the lens and take a good look at it, and so people begin to notice, oh, this is what the first moment of anger feels like. That person over there is squirming, and I can just catch myself just starting to be irritated. Do you know what I'm saying? Like under the microscope of mindfulness, and you can see. It's really good if you have something. I think weak emotions are great for our beginners, right? Because then there's no danger of you being swallowed up and embedded in the flood of emotion and becoming fully identified with it. Because if you practice some mindfulness and a little weak emotion comes up, you don't get sucked in, and you could just say, "Oh, let's put that under the introspective microscope of mindful attention," and so people can learn then about how their emotions arise and what they feel like in their bodies. Notice, like that's a lot of people. Oh, I have my body and then I have my feelings. But as far as you feeling things in your body, and anger is like comes up as sensations in the body, that we're interpreting a certain kind of way. It's like I feel this in my gut because he's a bad person, or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So you have to have cultivate through mindfulness. I'm presuming that these doctors and nurses and so forth are, learning to tune in to their own emotional states very much more closely and notice what's going on. This is actually, there's, I'm not going to go into it, but there's all this research now on meditators and mental states, and this is basically proven that if people practice mindfulness, even for 8 weeks, there's changes in their brain that are correlated with increased emotional intelligence on different scales and tests that you can give people. So it's not superstition, something like that. So, yeah. So that's very important. People have to know what they're feeling, and then. And not identify with it. I guess that's the next thing to say. I don't know, Mingyur Rinpoche has this thing about looking down on a flood, like there's a rapids here, but you're looking down on it instead of being in it, right? So mindfulness gives us this ability to get, say, a third-person perspective instead of I am really angry. Then you can say, oh, there's this stream of anger that's gushing along. Isn't that interesting? I wonder where it came from. I wonder, where does it want to go? Oh, it wants to make me hit that person. But of course I wouldn't actually do that. But isn't that interesting? We learn all kinds of things, because we're not in the river getting ready to hit. We're watching it. It's like, oh, that's an interesting human phenomenon unfolding, right? And that's called. There's words for this, in psychology as well as in Buddhist meditation, and in psychology they call this mentalizing, which I think is not very helpful because it could mean a zillion things. But what it means is to take your mental states and recognize them as mental states, rather than taking them as you. So it's that moment of mindfulness where you aren't just anger, you're a person who's noticing anger. And now you're separated from your anger as the observer of the anger. So the opposite of mentalizing is embeddedness, where you're in the flow of things, and you're identified with your emotions and your thoughts as they're happening, and you can't get yourself separated from it. One of the problems with embeddedness, that is not being able to be mindful and just fully identifying with whatever thought or feeling arises moment by moment, is a lot of people then have trouble If you don't recognize your thoughts and emotions as thoughts and emotions, then it's very easy to get them confused with reality. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, that's why I use that example as like, the reason I feel this in my gut is because he's a bad person. It's like, wait a minute, there's some steps that have been left out there, But it's like, that's how it feels. If you can watch how it feels and think, yes, that's how stupid we are most of the time. Exactly. And some people more than others, frankly. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? There's this issue of boundaries, and some people are better at making a distinction between what's happening here and then what might actually be the case out there. We all differ in our natural aptitude for that, just like some people start out better at feeling their emotions than others. Anyway, okay, so those are obviously some things. And then about self-awareness of emotions that come out of mindfulness, I assume that these people are learning, the doctors are, and the nurses. And then, of course, if you get some awareness of your own emotional states from practicing mindfulness, then you have the opportunity to do something with that. Like, I just use an example, if you have some weak emotion of annoyance or sexual attraction, you can, I'm thinking of the Vipassana romance and the Vipassana vendetta scenarios, where you don't actually know this person. You haven't had a crush on somebody you've never talked to since the 2nd grade, but now you do. And it's like, okay, so you know how silly that is, and you can watch it, right? This happens to a lot of people. And the same thing when you pick out the one really bad person who you don't know anything about. But it's just like your hostility, which you've usually been putting out in emails and road rage and arguments. And now you can't do that because you're just sitting. And so it has to come out. And so it finds a target. And maybe because you're, okay, well, gosh, we can't really shout at each other here. And so then you have to just watch what it's like. This is how crazy I am. It doesn't really take anything on the outside for me to be angry or for me to be lustful. Well, it just comes up, from this side. And so that's all very well and good as long as it's proportional to your strength as a meditator. So if you're like me, you want those things to be very weak. So that you won't get swallowed by them. I was thinking about Mingyur's Rinpoche thing about the stream, and if you get a flash flood, right, then you have to be very good to get on, to not get swallowed up and get embedded. And I think one of the things then is that you can't just keep watching. You have to apply an antidote. You have to do something other than just practice mindfulness. I suppose in theory, if you're super good at mindfulness, you could just do that. I guess. But, it's in practical experience, it doesn't seem to be very workable. You have to do something else. If you think you're really great at mindfulness and you push it a little too far, and find yourself acting impulsively in a way you didn't intend to. So, like if you get feeling, there are books on this topic, right? But, if you find yourself getting unreasonably angry, then you think you might get swallowed, you just have to regulate this in some way. So that's another aspect of emotional intelligence in Western psychological terms, applying antidotes. That's what it's called, self-regulation, when you use Western psychology speak. So you do something. Now, regulation is like a word that's, sounds kind of authoritarian. So, some like Buddhist teachers say working with your emotions rather than, regulating them. But, applying an antidote is like treating a sickness. So, if you start to feel angry in a way that makes you think that it's not enough to just be mindful, then you can reflect on what the heck good is this going to do to get angry at the situation. Do we have a lot of experience of becoming infuriating and that improving the outcome? Right. Great. if you just remember the past occasions where you really told that person what you, what you thought of them in an email. It's like you only have to do that a couple of times, and then, we should learn. This guy, Chade-Meng Tan, uses, for talking about regulation, he thinks about it in terms of riding a horse, which has, I think, a lot of interesting advantages. It's like working with a horse means first you have to notice what's going on with the horse and become sort of tuned into the horse, and then the horse just won't run wild. Or if it starts to, you'll know how to handle it, right? Yeah, I think that's because then you can use the horse to do all sorts of good things because you're using its energy rather than being used by it. First time I got it, first time you get on a horse, the horse just does what it wants, and you don't have any control. And like that, our emotions are a lot more powerful and we have to develop skills in being able to use them for good purposes. Yeah. So there's a lot of things like that. I think in my own case, I already talked about getting irritated at people who I know are well-intentioned but still feeling irritated at them. So usually I just revert to trying to cultivate, saying, okay, these people are human beings just like me who want to be happy and don't want to suffer, and they're not actually. They're very rarely do you encounter people who are irritating you because they're meaning harm. Now sometimes that could happen, but mostly people are irritating you without actually intending harm. They may be intending good or have neutral intentions, but yet nonetheless we get angry at them anyway. And so try to cultivate a wish for their well-being and loving kindness toward people, I think is like an antidote that has been helpful to me in these situations where I'm getting upset with folks. So that's what I want to say about I'm assuming that this would be very valuable to the doctors and nurses to get. The point is that even if so Joan Halifax doesn't use this language about emotional intelligence, but she's teaching them mindfulness practices that will increase their emotional sensitivity and their ability to work with their emotions. And I'm sure that that's part of what she's intending. And then, okay, so that's knowing our own emotions. And then there's the other part of it is empathy, understanding and connecting with other people. Obviously there's this thing that's misnamed theory of mind, which is this thing that we develop as we're growing up that is able to recognize that there are other beings besides ourselves, and tries to model what might be going on with them. Almost all of us are able to do that. It's part of the basis of how we function as social beings. And then, now it's pretty well known that at the neurological level that people have what's called mirror neurons, that there's a part of us that just seems to automatically reflect or mirror kinds of behaviors that we see around us. So it's not just we see, we pick the Buddhist, that famous saying with Ananda, right, where Ananda, he asks about having good friends. And the Buddha says, oh, that's not half of the religious life, that's the whole of religious life, is having the right kinds of friends. You're around the right kinds of people. It's partly, what they say and what they do and what you consciously take in. But underneath that and before that, right, there's also this unconscious modeling that constantly goes on, where if you're around people who have certain kinds of feelings and reactions and emotions, then without even thinking about it, there's a kind of mirroring of that goes on in your mind, and it's better to be mirroring the kind of model that you self-consciously have chosen rather than just a group of folks you happen to stumble in with, But that is like helplessly bobbing down the river of life. You know what I'm saying? It's like, well, these are the people that I happen to meet, so I'll just mirror them like that. We tend to be able to like have feelings, reflect the feelings of other people that we see around us, like to a certain extent. And there's different things that they've done all these tests in the lab with this stuff now, and there's different things that make that stronger or more likely or weaker or less likely. And so obviously, if we see other people as I don't know if it's obvious, if we see people as very much like ourselves, the more we identify with them, the more we see them as inside our sangha, so to speak, then the more we feel with them and for them and identify with them. And the more we see them as other or outside the circle, wherever we draw the line, the boundaries of Washington State. It's like, oh, those people over there in Idaho, right? And so it's like, so wherever the people who are outside the line, then we don't get as much of like this spontaneous mirroring or empathetic response for. And it's not just, of course, geographic lines. It's all these different religious lines and all the different lines that we have. So many different kinds of lines. And one of the lines that they've actually tested is political ideology, which comes up because of the discussion we were having yesterday, and is really true. They've done, repeatedly tests with people, and that people find it a lot harder to empathize with people who they know have different political beliefs from theirs. The red-blue thing, and it's just, it's a really strong line. It's a big thing for people to recognize that other people have ideas that are not just different from their own, but are antithetical to them, and yet they're still human beings. It's like, yeah, it's true. It's really true, and that's actually a big part. This is a big part of war, right? Because the people who want to organize the wars, they know that human beings don't just spontaneously wake up in the morning and decide to machine gun each other. They have to be trained to see the people on the other end of the bullets as not human. And it's the opposite of what we should be doing, is seeing everybody being in this, everybody having this common wish for happiness and not wishing for suffering and so forth. So if you train people in the un-I thou, train them to objectify or demonize the other, then you can deploy them to inflict violence on the objects of that hatred, the others on the other side of the boundary. Okay, so that's like a rough thing about emotional intelligence, is that if you have this kind of understanding of yourself, like you watch yourself and hey, I'm a person who tends to get angry. It's like over time, if you watch enough, then you see patterns in your personality. You not only know what you're feeling this second, but you get a sense as like what your tendencies are, or we would say, or your personality, or what kinds of afflictions tend to be stronger. And so your strengths and weaknesses. You become intimate with them in a sense, very familiar with them, and then you see that other people around are like that too, and they all want happiness, even the Republicans and so forth. You know what I'm saying? It's like, well, I forget exactly where I was going with that. But anyway, so there's awareness, self-regulation. Oh, and then I guess I wanted to say something about this, is like, I guess I already implied this, is that if you notice that you're starting to get angry, then if you're practicing mindfulness, you can always remember to stop, before you act on. There's a difference between angry and actually harming. And there's a space in between there, and practicing mindfulness meditation, of course, is like makes that space bigger and allows us to get, I don't know if it's exactly right to say, get control of our own lives. Seems a little bit crudely unphilosophical. But yeah, sometimes it is talked about the Buddha as gaining self-mastery. That's in Lamrim Chemo, one place that term occurs, and Joshua and I were wrestling over how to translate it, because he uses the word self, So you get control of your own life. That is, you're able to make choices instead of just bobbing along the stream of thoughts and emotions and then justifying yourself. I think this is a lot of what happens is like people say, why did you get so angry? It's like, well, actually you don't know because you haven't looked into the matter. But what you can do is justify and defend yourself, because you become very skilled at developing rationalizations for behavior. I think this is what mostly goes on when people talk to each other about, well, why did you do this or why did you do that? People don't know. But they get defensive, partly because they know that they don't know at some level, and so they have to make up a story that justifies, what they did. This is mostly what goes on, I think. Well, that's the bad not knowing.
Well, to know that you don't know why you're angry is a good thing.
That's true. But see, that's a knowing. Yeah. Anyway, well, yeah, the question is maybe, like all this, I'm talking about emotional intelligence, and you're right, it implies knowing, and I'm pro-knowing generally. I mean, I made clear about that. But I'm trying to see, that it is this, from the context of what is darkness, or, for Joan Halifax, or not knowing, what is it supposed to be canceling out? It's very clear that it's not canceling out understanding your own feelings. It's not canceling out understanding other people as human beings. It's not canceling out understanding that other people want to be happy. Do you know what I'm saying? These are things that, from whatever it is she's doing, that not knowing is opening the door to those kinds of understanding at a very deep level for people. Right? So what is it canceling out? Well, we'll talk more about that. But I mean, like one thing, you can cancel out, fixed ideas about who you are or what you have to defend, or, a priori schemas or grids that you take into the situation and figure out which cookie cutter hole that each person you meet fits into, like they were actually an object. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think maybe that's one sort of thing, at least, that the not in not knowing is canceling out to make room for this other stuff. Yeah. Okay, so a thing that's related to this, a concept in Western psychology that's related to this, is attunement. And I wrote something that's kind of, trying to, in my own mind, make a connection between this idea of attunement and, my Buddhist thinking. And I put this as the selection 19, the care of empty persons. This isn't the whole, it's a longer paper that I gave at a conference on Buddhism and science in Sarnath. Maybe I should just read this. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worthwhile. So, like other Mahayana Buddhists today, His Holiness, that means the Dalai Lama, teaches that there are no ichantikas. What are ichantikas? Are people that some Buddhists believe in who will never get out of cyclic existence. Yeah. People who will never get out of cyclic existence. Huh? Ichantikas. That's a word in Sanskrit for this category of being. The point is that it's a category. From the point of view of Mahayana Buddhism, it's a null set. but the reason it comes up is because there are people. I mean, there are Buddhists who hold that or have. I don't know that there are today, but there were certainly Buddhists who believed that there were some people who would never become free from cyclic existence. So we all have the potential to reach happiness. And to fulfill that, we must not only seek to minimize harm, but also do what we can, starting where we are now, to help living beings. So we should intentionally foster, our happiness depends on our intentionally fostering, cultivating, strengthening within ourselves the inclination and the determination to alleviate the misery of other beings and help them toward happiness. Buddhism is a tradition or maybe a complex web of traditions for training the mind in virtue. Revering those who love compassion is admirable, but real Dharma is found when we're inspired to train our own minds so as to increase our inclination, determination, and capacity to help others. So this guy who's in the film Footprint of the Buddha, Bhikkhu Balangoda Ananda Maitreya, who died in 1998, he just explained metta meditation to the loving kindness meditation to the interviewer, and it emphasizes this point that it always has to start with loving yourself. He says you must truly wish well for yourself and thus know yourself as a lovable being, as a beloved being. It's very hard. This is like, I don't know, it's like if you read Tara Brach's books, but her first book was basically about people in the West not being able to get to the first base on this one, like not being able to accept themselves or not being able to love themselves. And all the problems they have with other people come out of the fact that they basically don't wish well for themselves. They don't care for themselves. They mainly have internalized negative things that other people have said about them, and then constantly saying those things to themselves, and so that they just think that that's what they need to do, is be beaten all the time internally. So he says, a man who does not love, it's all man-oriented in this film, a man who does not love himself can never love another. It is impossible. So the sphere of love, as in this Theravada teaching, once first well established here, that is, that I truly wish happiness for myself, and I know that I wish happiness myself, and I'm not ashamed of wishing happiness for myself, and I wish that I may be well, right? And that then you can expand this to include other beings. So then, I'm saying we find this well aligned with a large and steadily growing volume of research in an aspect of psychology known as attachment theory, which is empirically based on extensive observations of parent-child interactions in both the United States and Uganda. And it shows that our capacity to care for others doesn't proceed from some inner deprivation, but it has to be founded in some way, at some point, on some earlier experience of yourself as being, of connecting, of relating, and finding satisfaction in emotional sharing. It occurred to me that, like, so when they do this in the lab, they're working with mothers and toddlers, but it doesn't have to be, the initial caregiver, although that makes a big difference. But it doesn't have to be. Many of us have non-optimal caregivers initially, right? Not everybody can be the perfect parent, and so then it doesn't mean that your ceiling is set by the quality of your initial caregiver, because you can find other people to care for you, like a spiritual teacher. It occurs to me very much when Venerable Chögyam was talking about people having difficulty with their spiritual teachers, that it's hard not to see this as extension of the kinds of problems that they would have had with their parents. And now they're still they're taking these people, they're having trouble, they're taking the child position, and they're putting the spiritual teacher as their parent, and all the issues that are they're still working those things out. I'm sorry to psychologize, but it seems these things seem inescapable. So anyway, there's a style of connecting and relating to others, or not connecting, that is shaped by our early caregiving relationships. And it is just quickly, they're primary caregivers who ignore or dismiss children's emotional needs tend to raise children who are avoidant, interpersonally avoidant, that focusing mainly on objects or ideas, or maybe achievements like climbing Mount Everest, being the best chess player, rather than engagement with other human beings. So as infants, these children learn, or as young toddlers, that their efforts to connect are futile because their parent isn't connecting with them. And on the other hand, you have other caregivers who respond in an inconsistent and misattuned way. Like they grab the child when the child doesn't want to be grabbed, or they push the child away and it can be, it's misattuned to what the child really needs. And so then the children grow up, instead of this kind of avoidant or distance, you get people who are kind of anxious and clinging and glommy, I don't know is the word in my mind, but grasping onto what they hope will be a source of love, but it might just disappear at any second. Where children have to learn to be extremely persistent in expressing needs, because unless they do, they don't get that kind of connection, and then people keep acting like that later on. So then, if you have the middle way, if you're well attuned to your baby, physically available, empathetically responsive, then these people overwhelmingly raise children who are secure and well able to connect with others. Now, this book, Searching Inside Yourself, never talks about attachment theory. But what he does say is that as people gain in self-understanding emotionally from practicing mindfulness meditation, and then ability to apply antidotes, we would say, or regulate or work with their emotions effectively, that they become more self-confident. This makes a lot of, they're not, another way to put that is like, they're not so defensive. They're able to like accept criticism, right? Because people, when they become more self-confident, it doesn't mean that they're brash and overbearing, right? It means that they don't have to worry about whether someone's, pointing out something they did wrong, because they have a basic sense of knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are and being okay with themselves. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying, is I think that this comes out of this kind of an attuned caregiver, whether it be your initial caregiver or somebody else later on, a neighbor or a relative or a spiritual teacher, who gives you that kind of care. It makes it possible for you to recognize yourself as care-worthy, and then from caring for yourself, you can expand this bubble of empathy out to include all the others like yourself. Then, of course, the trick is to recognize that, like, all these living beings are like ourselves, right? And not leave people out, like, the ones who are on the wrong side of certain lines that we draw, right? But at least you have the possibility of loving others once you have this idea of yourself as love. So I'll skip down a little bit. In the 7 cause and effect precept system for cultivating bodhichitta, as you know, you start by thinking about living beings and how we're all alike. That we all want happiness and we don't want suffering. And that's just, it's like, well, I know that about me, but it's like, I hadn't really thought about the others, but oh yeah, I guess that might be true. We have to actually start to think about how, I don't know. I have this thing where I do with my students where I say, it's like, suppose that this ceiling fan, we're in the position to make a choice to just make, one person in this room happy. Don't you feel that it ought to be you? It's like, I'm here. Guru calling me, shoot some light this way, yeah. And so people aren't thinking about, it's exactly the same from everybody. It's not like, what are my special qualifications that I will put forth? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm uniquely deserving of happiness. No, it's like when you think about it, it's like, this is so absurd. It's like everybody equally wants happiness and doesn't want suffering. So that's not going to work. And then we have all these different kinds of possible relationships with one another. Even within one lifetime, we have different relationships with people that can change a lot. But, over many lifetimes, we have different kinds of relationships with beings. There's like people sound like, what have you done for me lately kind of attitude. Yeah, I know you're my mother, but, there are people who are, a lot closer to me now. And it's like, well, you can see that, that's kind of a shoddy attitude to take towards our mothers. So, the meditator then goes on, having recognized all these different relationships, to focus on this idea of other beings as ideal mothers. Not just like, oh, all these beings my mothers, but some of them were kind of bad at it. No, it's like there's this idealized idea, of how each mother took care of us. And there's like so many passages like this in Tibetan texts, and you guys know them, right? Gyume Khyentse Ngawang Laikten talks about one should reflect on the delightful ways a mother holds a baby to her flesh. Except for having the shape of a human being, the child's like a helpless bug. Teaches it one word at a time. How to sleep, how to eat, how to put on clothes, how to urinate, how to defecate. And if your mother hadn't taught you these, you would still be like a bug. Just like over on your back, it's thinking like a baby on its back, just going like that with its arms and legs. So, and then Lamrim Chemo says, when you were a helpless newborn infant, she held you to the warmth of her flesh and bounced you on the tips of her 10 fingers, suckled you at her breast, used her mouth to give you food, and removed mucus from your nose, apparently with her mouth, and used her hand to wipe away your excrement. When you were hungry and thirsty, she gave you food and drink. And when you suffered from illness, pain, or threat of death, your mother chose from the depths of her heart that she would rather be sick than see you be sick, rather be in pain than for you to be in pain, rather die than for you to die. And putting these feelings into action, she did what was needed. So, stepping back from the Tibetan thing, it's like looking at it from the psychology side again. It seems like these teachings can in part be understood as enshrining the image of a well-attuned mother as the model for the bodhisattva's love for beings. Now, initially on the surface, it's like, well, we should take care of those beings because they're our mothers. But implicitly, what it's also saying is just as those mothers took care of us when we were helpless, so should we be this caring mother who's willing to give our lives for and not think of anything as impure if it's associated with caring for the one we love. So just as our mothers cared for us, so should we care for them by leading them to the true happiness of enlightenment. And if you bring to bear the insights of attachment theory, it suggests that we begin systematically cultivating the vast love of a bodhisattva only by working from a secure base of some sort. Your connection to a spiritual teacher being one example of that. And giving us a deep conviction that we ourselves are lovable and have been loved. Right? If someone is really caring for you, and they're bothering to put time into helping you and sacrifice things that they could otherwise have done otherwise, then you feel a sense of gratitude and appreciation for them, but also it's like, oh, well, someone at least thinks that I'm worthy of having happiness. Maybe the lamp in the ceiling didn't, but my mother or my teacher does. Yeah. So in this, this passage I took from a book that I'm going to read from, it's called Attachment and Psychotherapy by David Wallen. It's a wonderful book about how therapists can use mindfulness meditation to help people and become more attuned, even if they're starting out from a less than ideal attachment style. And so this is the passage. When my daughter was, this is a story that a man tells. When my daughter was just shy of 18 months, I was the parent who woke in the night to her frantic cries of, "Mommy, Mommy." When she saw me opening the door to her room, she was furious. "Bad Daddy, I hate you. Get Mommy." Which was hardly the reception I'd hoped for at 3 in the morning. I've personally experienced almost exactly this, so I identified him. Tense. Trying to be heard over her screams, I told her with an edge in my voice, we know what that is, that Mommy was sleeping and that I was not going to wake her. But then I found myself softening as I suddenly saw, tuned into the logic of her behavior. If she were loud enough, she would get her mother. And I found myself getting calmer, and immediately, without thinking about it, I had to put that in bold, right? I mirrored her rage with an exaggerated mean face accompanied by a tiny growl to mark my display as pretend. Maybe you think, God, that's so sophisticated, right? He didn't make a plan and here's my mission plan, of how to do this. It just came out of this, spontaneously of how to interact with another human being. And then he said, "Aw," voicing real sympathy with the need and disappointment that was behind her anger. Listening, I then heard her repeating a new phrase beneath her tears, "Daddy, make me feel better." We shared a hug, we shared a song, and she went back to sleep for the night. So when the father understands his daughter's feelings, his own feelings change, and then this frees him to do this mirroring back of her feelings so that she sees that he knows what she is feeling. And she can see herself in the mirror. He's attuned to her, and she can see that. And she can see that he feels with, and he has empathy for her, and that he understands her, and that he wants to help her, and then she can ask for that help. So her feelings aren't like she's overwhelming and isolating, and this kind of connection is made. Yes?
Part of what's really important about that passage is that he's not looking at her to tell him that he's lovable.
Right. Oh, yeah.
He already knows that she's lovable.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, it's really important, right? Because if he hasn't gotten to that place himself, then he'll just be really angry at the child for wanting the mother instead of him. And he's like, he's able to recognize that that's going on, but not be so wounded by it that he can't tune into her. Yeah, exactly. So that's what it means, that you have to have somehow discover yourself as lovable before you can become undefended enough to really connect with others. It's like a passing it on, you know. We pass on bad things from generation to generation, right? But then there's also this. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes, you know, down generation from generation. Yeah. Yes? Right. Lots of research. Yeah, I know. Yeah, the book, David Wallen's book, I'm a big fan of Attachment and Psychotherapy, and it talks a lot about this research, especially the early research on establishing that attachment theory has an empirical basis. But then, as you point out, there's been continued to be a lot of research since then on this. So let's flip that over to a Buddhist context from a little bit. I thought we could go to passage 1 now and look at this. You know, there's so many stories about the Buddha as a skillful teacher, but I just thought that might, this, you know, the one about Kisagatami might be worth, you know, looking at. So it comes from I took this off access2insight.com, which has all kinds of polytext and translation by different people, all well organized. And this is by that guy, Andrew Olazanaki or something, I can't remember. And so from a commentary on the Therigatha, it tells the story about the woman, Gautami Tisa, who was nicknamed Skinny Gautami. And she was poor. She went to her husband's family. She was scorned because she'd come from a poor family. But she gave birth to a son, which is a big score, you know, for women in the traditional world. So because that's carries on the family line for the family she's been married into. So then she had respect. But as her son was running around and playing, he was killed. He died on something. I don't know the story of how exactly he died, but something killed him. And then because of this, she had what we would say some pathological grief, or maybe psychotic grief, extremely complicated grief, sorrow to the point of madness is the text. And she thought, before everybody just scorned me, but when my son was born, he had honor. Now they're going to take my son. She doesn't say the body. They're going to take my son and expose him out in the charnel ground. Like they're going to add injury to injury. You know, they're going to take my son and put him out to rot and be pecked at by the vultures. So the influence of her sorrow to the point of madness, she took the corpse on her hip, wandered, in the city from door of one house to another, pleading for medicine for her son. And the people, of course, reviled her until a certain wise man recognized that she was deranged by sorrow and that the Buddha might be able to help her, and sent her to the Buddha. And so she went to the vihara when the Buddha was teaching and asked for medicine for her son. The master, seeing her situation, said, "Go, and having entered the city, into whatever house has never experienced any death, take from them a mustard seed." Okay, so we know their story, right? And she, of course, cannot find any house of anybody where there hasn't been an experience of death. But this doesn't she's deranged, and so it takes a while going from house to house before it starts to dawn on her that she isn't going to find any mustard seed. What I wanted to say about this in terms of Buddha as a well-attuned teacher here is that he doesn't say to her, "What the hell are you talking about? That guy's dead." He doesn't say, "Well, your relatives should expose him on the charnel ground, and of course everybody dies, and so what the heck would you expect?" Essentially, that's what the people who were reviling her initially were saying. And what do you say? The underlying facts of the situation are not different. Do you see what I'm saying? Buddha is trying to teach her that, this is a universal fact, but he teaches her in a way that is attuned to her situation and her mind. It's skillful teaching that arises out of his attunement to her emotional state. It wouldn't work. And okay, so I have, recent personal experience of this. It's like, so my wife is dying of cancer. She's not exactly happy with the situation. But some well-meaning people will say to her, "Well, you should just be glad that you're not dying of cancer on the streets of Calcutta. Or you should just recognize that there's lots of, other people who are just as bad off or worse than you are." Now, of course, those things are completely true. And also, they weren't helpful at that particular time for her. But then you think, well, maybe if they're not helpful at that particular time for her, they would be helpful to somebody else or to her later on. There's this problem of, you don't exactly know for sure. You know what I'm saying? You don't exactly know for sure. Being nice, as I was saying at the beginning, isn't always the most helpful thing. But there's different ways to put across the same information, some of which are more attuned and more skillful than others. Yeah. And so, we're given a story which seems, to be have a real, ring of truth to it about the Buddha as a skillful teacher. And yes.
What do you think would have helped
Yeah. That's a good question. What I found to be most helpful was to empathize with her rather than instructing her. People have to, I just think in general, you have to, and people, I think that, this is partly the problem. When someone says, you should be glad that your situation isn't worse, what they're doing implicitly is they're avoiding fully empathizing with you and suffering with you by pointing out why this is just normal and not you know what I'm saying? So it's an avoidance technique. They're doing their own avoidance, and they're inviting you to engage in the same thing. Instead of saying, well, yeah, of course this is really terrible, and I can understand why you would feel so horrible, or something that extends along those lines. If you take the example of the dad, he can't actually comfort this baby until she has been able to understand that he is feeling what she's feeling. And this is the problem. When the Kisa Gotami goes door to door, all these people, they're as aware as the Buddha is that the baby is dead. right? And so, but their response is like doesn't have this element of, understanding where she's coming from, feeling for her, and then helping her from within that place. Yeah. That's what people have to do. I don't think people want to trust advice that's coming from someone that they don't know really understands what they're feeling. Yeah. Of course, that has to do with maybe why we could trust a spiritual teacher, because we feel that this person has insight into what's going on with us that goes beyond what we ourselves have, right? I have one little other example, but it's so much vaguer than the one that I already gave, where I think I alluded to it. Where this teacher says somebody comes to us asking for advice, but instead of offering stuff out of the guidebook, consoling platitudes, or the wisdom that we heard from someone else parroted, we find ourselves saying something that we didn't know we knew. Like the thing, and then he said, such gestures and words spring from the body and tongue with shocking spontaneity. This reminds me of the little description of the father responding to the infant. It's like this is just something that he made up at the spot. Fortunately, he was able to remember it and describe it later, right? But it wasn't something that he knew how to do or could plan to do. So he says, like, things arise like this, we can't really call them mine. That is, it's not generated intentionally from a self over here, but it's not really copied from another person either. And so then you can sort of see them as rising out of what? Some larger, it's a compassion production, or something that's, arising out of something that we know that we don't know we know, or some, if you want to go there, some sort of place of unknowing or before thinking kind of mind. Yeah. It's an attunement thing. I like the word attunement myself, but there's different, maybe people like to say not knowing. Anyway. Okay. So, let's see. 10:15. All right. So, one of the things, and I'm going to make a transitional statement. Halifax sees not knowing as a practical skill, and she seems to be really been very helpful to a lot of people in that way. But when you read her book, as I try to point out, there's certain places where she brings in a kind of mysticism or a Buddhist philosophy, mysticism, in which this not knowing isn't just like a sort of way of talking about attunement or emotional intelligence, but it's also a kind of a goal or a ground of being. That is that it's, well, if I'm thinking basis, path, and fruit, right? And we've been talking about not knowing as something in the middle, as a practice in the path. But then Halifax and her teacher seem to have it, Bernie Glassman, seem to have it sort of also as something like that is the basic nature of reality. And it's also kind of like the way that we harmonize our minds with the basic nature of reality by becoming, like in the Tao Te Ching that we were doing yesterday, by becoming unknowing, we put ourselves in harmony with the fundamental unknowability of things as they are. So that, what I'm saying is that that's a little bit different from saying unknowing as a way to talk about a practice. It's unknowing as the ultimate reality, and unknowing as the kind of consciousness that can know the ultimate reality, whether that's a separate thing or the same thing, depending on what kind of philosophy you have about ultimate reality. And that's my point. I decided to use the word ultimate reality here because it finesses the difference between different religions, right? Right. Everybody within Buddhism and apart from Buddhism has their own, in other religions, has their own ideas about ultimate reality. I guess if you're, if you're a materialist, then, it's the energy, matter, back and forth thing. And then, if you're an idealist, it's like nature of consciousness itself, and matter is just an illusory side effect of that, right? So then people have, like some people have God as the divine creator, not only divine creator of the world, but like a person who somehow mysteriously underlies the world as its ultimate reality all the time. So I just wanted to point out that like these people on the Christian side have some very, unusual but strongly worded, not knowing kinds of statements. And this is passage number 16 on your handout. It's not like you find this going down the street to the average church, but in the 9th century, John Scotus Erigena said, "We do not know what God is." He's sort of saying to be a theist, you have to also be an agnostic ultimately and recognize that you don't know. God himself does not know what he is. Why? Because he's not anything. This is a Christian. He's not anything. Literally, God is not, because he transcends being. God isn't like being with a capital B. God transcends being and not being. There isn't any category that God can fit into. The placing of God in categories such as one, many, good, evil, right, existing, not existing, is a human conceptual activity. Right? And that the most godlike knowledge of God, it has to be an unknowing. Because even God himself can't, just like Buddha himself can't find words to describe suchness just as it is, so then he holds up a flower. Likewise, there's all these words, but then they're actually not God, or they can't describe God just as God is. This phrase, most godlike knowledge of God is known by way of unknowing, comes from another Christian mystic text from the 14th century called the Cloud of Unknowing, which I read a long time ago when I was working on my dissertation. It's a lot of it is somewhat like you would expect. It's about God. People obviously believe in God in a regular Christian way. But then when they talk about really getting down to God and contemplating God and knowing God in the most intimate, or we would say like yogic, non-conceptual way, it turns out to not be anything like what they've said before. So he says, it may be good at times to think specifically of the kindness and excellence of God. And this could be a light. I think that means something to cheer you up and brighten your mind. And it could be a part of contemplation. But when you get into the serious work of contemplation per se, this kind of idea about thinking that God is good or that God is great has to be dispensed with and covered up with a cloud of forgetting, because the most godlike knowledge of God is known by way of unknowing. Hildegard de Bingen has something very, very similar that she says. Yeah, but the cloud of unknowing is, I think, not. Yeah, it's the same tradition. It's called via negativa, which means, Latin for the negative path. And this most godlike knowledge of God by way of unknowing is in the cloud of unknowing, but it's actually a quote from an earlier writer called Pseudo-Dionysus. And actually no one knows who Pseudo-Dionysus is. Somebody who pretended to be Dionysus, apparently. Yeah, so anyway, but the point is that there's a long tradition of talking about these kinds of things, and it's kind of it's sort of on the lowdown. It's not the main thing that the Pope talks about and so forth, but that people were, what I'm saying, but that it was there's a little current going along where these some subset of the hermits and nuns and monks were getting very deep into it, and they kind of got to a point where it wasn't that they disagreed with the theology, but they were experiencing things that went outside it or beyond it. And you think it has to be true when you have a guy say something like, God himself does not know what he is because he is not anything. Literally, God is not because he transcends being. Well, it's just lucky that he got away with that, He could have gotten into trouble, depending on what century and what country you say these things in. And then, I don't know, I just decided to put a little thing from St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul in here. I don't see it as being a perfectly pure example in the same way of the same kind of negative mysticism, but it's a different kind. There's a famous poem called Dark Night of the Soul where he says, "On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, oh happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. In darkness and secure by the secret ladder, disguised, oh happy chance, in darkness and in concealment, my house now being at rest." So, this is very complicated, but, it's sort of under the guise of having a secret love tryst, description. It's a poem about connecting with God in a very deep way that has to be done in darkness. Oh, I'm thinking of like branching streams flow in darkness, Suzuki Roshi, the way the deepest kind of connection has to be found in a place that's before thinking, or under the radar. But there's like another level of meaning too here, which is the Dark Night of the Soul refers to this sort of place of spiritual barrenness that you go through, maybe parallel to shamanic sickness. It certainly is parallel to shamanic sickness for Joan Halifax. I mean, she almost explicitly says this. She says the fruitful darkness. Later in Being with Dying, she calls it the lucky dark. And she's like, this is definitely explicitly playing off, the idea of St. John of the Cross, as you references St. John of the Cross. Why the darkness is fortunate because it gives us this opportunity to connect. Like when people don't go into darkness, then they just believe in the conventional pieties of religion. But they don't go into this place where they have this deeper experience. So anyway, this kind of thing, I don't know. We've seen it in Taoism. You can see that there's something going on like that in certain kinds of Christian mysticism. And, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard de Bingen, other examples that I didn't put in. But, and it's also, maybe you can say similar negative things in Islam and Hinduism. Yeah. Mm.
Is part of not knowing there perhaps related to
Sorry, what? To what?
not being able to put in words aesthetic
Uh-huh.
aspect of
I don't know. Yeah. Okay, here's a way to talk about it. I'll just say like a simpler contemporary Christian, okay? There's a book called Honest to God, and it's written for everybody. It's not like erudite. It's now you can write about these things more openly, right? So Honest to God by Bishop Robinson, I forgot his first name, and he basically says, pretty much all Christians are idolaters. He doesn't say it in a rude way, but he says basically you should realize that when you worship, you have an idea or an image of God in your mind, and that is not God, and it cannot be. Yeah, and it's not the only book that says that. There's another book that's, I think, a little less good called Your God is Too Small. It's the same idea, but it's less interestingly developed. Right, it's not new stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yes.
Do you happen to know whether St. John of the Cross is
Well, I don't remember that. It sounds, when you say that, it has a ring to it, as though that might be true, but I don't remember specifically. Right, but at least in the way the poem is interpreted and explained, including by himself in his auto-commentary. It's not about being in prison so much as it's being in a state where he cannot feel the presence of God in any ordinary way, which as a Christian he's accustomed to. And so he's gone into kind of like a dark place where all his ideas about God, all his sense of ordinarily, it's like a desert, where there's nothing that he thought that he knew or felt about God is available to him. So it's like that kind of darkness that he's able to meet God on a deeper way. And that's the way I understand it. It's just, okay, so I don't want to move on, but so, obviously in Hinduism, there's a kind of important part of jnana yoga, which is a negative, the path of knowledge or path of wisdom involves kind of a practice called neti, which is where you everything that comes to your mind or to your senses, everything that comes to your attention, you recognize and identify as not the ultimate, and therefore, instead of falling into this kind of what Christian would call an idolatrous mode, you by the process of exclusion of anything that you could possibly think of experience, arrive at Brahman, this sort of ultimate reality as something that's, transcendent of all that is accessible to our ordinary mind, to know ordinary knowing. And that's so the knowing, the deep, and you could say in that way of practicing Hinduism, that, the most godlike knowledge of God is known by way of unknowing. But they don't mean a paradox. They mean that you know God by way of recognizing all the things that are not God, that basically being everything that you can think of, until there's just this sort of ground of being, which you can't specifically point at. Right. And, I don't know, similar thing in Sufi mysticism too, but we'll pass over that so we can move on to the next thing. Not knowing in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, so I want to subdivide this into not knowing as a goal and not knowing as a practice. Oh, I'm thinking of, Shilam Dre. So, not knowing as a path or a practice by which we attain something, or not knowing as being the ultimate fruit. Could it be the case that, instead of attaining to omniscience, we attain to total unknowingness instead? Is there Buddhists who say something like that? So then that goes to the question of how does a Buddha know stuff, and if so, which stuff and how? So this is like a very complicated, difficult topic, but I'm just going to say a few things about it that I find interesting. I think passage number 26, I have a little excerpt from the Lalita Vistara, which is like great because you can see a very natural vision of the Buddha as being just like us and thinking about things and trying to make up his mind. So this is after, Buddha has achieved perfect enlightenment and is then trying to decide what to do. And I had to make some ellipses to get this down to our point here. Oh, how profound is this Dharma I have awakened to it. It's foundationless. It has no representations, nor can it be represented. It is unconditioned and without conceptions, without expression or demonstration even. If I were to teach others this Dharma, they might not understand it, and so perhaps I should remain silent. My path goes against the grain. That's where we said that line. It is profound and hard to see. Those blinded by passion will not see it. And he's sort of implying, well, that would be pretty much everybody. So it's pointless to teach it. And there's similar kinds of stories that are in earlier texts. So this version of the life of the Buddha came along pretty late. But anyway, the point is that this Buddha is a very naturalistic person whose thought processes seem to be like ours. He thinks thoughts clearly. He has a problem to solve. He's not sure how to solve it. He gets advice from others about, like an inspiration from others who come to give. That's not part isn't in here, but then he gets, he's invited and encouraged to teach, and by gods. And then he kind of reaches this conclusion that, well, there's a lot of people who there's no possible way they'll understand it, and there are other people there's no possible way they'll benefit from it, even if they could understand it. But then there might be a few in the middle, who actually could understand it and could benefit it from it. And so, for their sake, that's in the Lalita Vistara Sutra. That's the way it goes. It's like there are some people who will benefit, and so I'll go out and teach for their sake. So that's the way Buddha appears in some early accounts, and it's like certainly at one extreme where you see the Buddha as being like someone we could not be mystified about the way that mind works, but is like, sort of like us. I was looking at this. I was just randomly looking at books, and today I found in Jan Nadir's book about a very early Mahayana Buddhist text called the Urga Paripricha. There's a section talking about early Mahayana ideas about the Buddha. And Jan Nyate, is a Buddhist scholar. She argues in here that in this particular early Mahayana text, that there's definitely a bodhisattva ideal, but the bodhisattva ideal is not aiming for a Buddha who just keeps going and going. You aim to become a Buddha who has an amazing mind, an amazing body, and then dies or passes into parinirvana at the end of one amazingly helpful lifetime. And then as that's being described, someone in pencil wrote in the margin, as His Holiness said, who would follow the bodhisattva path in this case? In other words, given that the bodhisattva path is so long and arduous, would anybody really undertake it with the idea that they'll have one good lifetime at the end? So that you get this I was thinking about this in terms of the 7 cause and effect precepts. So when you get to the number 6, right, you have this sublime attitude, Hloksam in Tibetan, this you're altruistic, all-loving, all-compassionate, and you really want to, not only that, you really would like to do everything you possibly can to be of benefit to all sentient beings. But what? Right? But what? There's of course, bodhicitta is a linkage between this altruistic love, universal love and compassion with a specific goal in mind, through which you will be able to be maximally effective, and that's the aspiration to become a Buddha. You could have a person, I always tell my students, you could have a person who aspires to be a Buddha because they've heard that the Buddha is the most powerful person in the world, and they really are into power, right? And then you could have a person who really wants to help. Well, we do have people who really want to help as many as they can, but the possibility of becoming a Buddha seems either impossible or unrealistic, and so you can't really count them as bodhisattvas in that way. So those are the 2 things that you're supposed to think about, like in terms of trying to aspire to become a Buddha. Is it necessary, and is it possible? And this just always struck me, that they cut exactly the opposite way from one another. The idea that it's necessary to become a Buddha to fulfill my aims of being of most possible help to other beings focuses on the difference between my current limitations and what the powers and nature of a Buddha. And you think about, you meditate on how, I can only speak in one language at a time, and I don't know what everybody in the room is thinking, and I don't know what everybody in the room most needs to hear, and I can't simultaneously say the very best thing to keep everybody's attention. Do you know what I'm saying? And as soon as I say something that's helpful to one person, it will be inevitably confusing to another person. But unlike that, the Buddha doesn't have that problem. He's able to be the perfect teacher and do all these things simultaneously. So you go on like that, and think about we can only look things from one point of view at a time. Buddha has this sort of panoptic perspective. And so you think, well, if I really want to have the most, be the best capable of becoming a Buddha, most capable of helping others, then I should have like the powers of a Buddha would be the best way to do it. So that makes it seem necessary, not just to use a little bit of resources for a little bit of time to help others, but to, get this kind of possibility. If it were possible. And, right, so that's the other thing. Like, is it actually possible for little old me to become a Buddha? Like, you've just finished thinking about, like, how different you are from a Buddha. It's like, you already kind of knew that. But now you've been systematically reflecting upon the gap, right? And the more you imagine the Buddha as, like, unlike yourself, then the less likely it becomes that you could be, that would seem to become, that you could be transformed into such a being. Right? So you have this, like, as I'm trying to say, these aren't two things that fit together automatically. They're on the surface, they're clearly pulling in the opposite direction. And I think that a lot of the different visions, like that you see about, like, what a Buddha is like within Mahayana texts, the Buddha thought about this and then decided to do that, versus, one in which the Buddha never thinks about anything because the Buddha doesn't have any thoughts, and then Buddha just spontaneous. You have, like, different ideas of, like, well, how much like us do we want Buddha to be, versus how super amazing. When you make the Buddha super amazing, then people will pray, but they might not aspire. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that was my thought about that. And so I think that that's kind of what's going on with some of these different interpretations of, how the Buddha's mind works. Now, one of the things has to do with, like, the question of whether the Buddha is thinking about things, whether the Buddha has thoughts. Like, one way of knowing is obviously conceptual thinking, and the Laliva Visvara seems to depict the Buddha as having thoughts, and even it would seem doubts. But then that doesn't, come to be like the mainstream way of looking at this. Now we know that in Vasubandhu and Abhidharmakosha and Asanga's Abhidharma Samucha, the Abhidharma texts, that mindfulness meditation, the practice of the path, is depicted in terms of a discernment, recognizing what factors. You have a big catalog of factors, and you're recognizing, this is what's arising in my experience now, and understanding your familiarity with these dharmas, these factors, then which ones are virtuous and which ones are non-virtuous. Like if, like yesterday, Venerable Children showed me what a weed was. What's that weed called? Knapweed. You showed me knapweed. I didn't know what that was. So you showed me what knapweed was. And it's like, so if I would go down and garden, then I will have to know the difference between the flowers and the knapweed, right? And then, I'll know which ones to pull and which ones not to pull. And this is not a random example. This is exactly the way bhavana, cultivation, bhavana meditation means cultivation. Cultivation means growing. It's agricultural. You're growing stuff. You're trying to grow the right stuff, not the wrong stuff. And so it's not like, just let everything grow in the garden. It's like meditation is this sort of intentional process of going in there and looking for what's growing and deciding to give some better causes and conditions to some things and not to the others. You know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, that's one way of thinking about what the meditative process is, that it involves some sort of conceptual work. I'll come back to what, there's a reason why I brought that up. So at that point, when somebody's writing like that, thinking doesn't sound so bad, and it wouldn't be horrible necessarily to have a Buddha who was doing some good thinking, right? But then thinking, right? You could have good thoughts, right? And then better thoughts, and then best thoughts. But then there comes to be, in the history of Buddhist philosophy, a kind of idea develops that, like, thought is always wrong. I mean, even when it's right, it's wrong, basically, right? And that that seems to develop with Dharmakirti. Dharmakirti is our friend. We shouldn't be afraid of Dharmakirti. But yeah, he's the guy who brings like hardcore logic and epistemology into the tradition. And one of his big things, which just, we wrestle with down to today, is thinking about how language relates to the world. So when I'm perceiving over there and I perceive black, and there's sort of a triangular-like shape over there, right? But then when I say, oh, it's a camera, is it? I think it is. Whatever it is, I say, oh, it's a camera. Then what is that? That's I'm lumping it together with all these other things which I'm not seeing at all, and abstracting, So, I could have said, that's a potential spear. You know what I'm saying? Or I said, that's an overgrown carrot. You know what I'm saying? It's like I have all kinds of thoughts about it. But when I say recognize it as a camera, and then I lump it together with other cameras that are not present, but which I remember in my mind, then I'm creating a kind of general representation. I don't know, it's in Tibetan, something we call it like a generic image or a general, it's sort of like an abstraction. And the technical term in philosophy, Western philosophy, is a universal. So it means something that is like not the particular specific, individual, specifically characterized, perceivable thing that's in front of us, but something that thought and language can work with and refer to. That's the point, is that thoughts and language don't refer to and work with the actual things. They refer to categorizations of those things, which are not those things. And they tends to take, like when I say, that's a camera, I don't think, there's a black triangular thing which it would be suitable for me to place in the camera category. But no, I just really think that's a camera. And actually, that's wrong in some sense, right? Because camera is this universal generic quality which is just one way of thinking about what's there. I don't know, this is one way I'm trying to explain what Dharmakirti is going to say, which maybe is disturbing. But basically, and if you look at passage number 27, it's very complicated to read Dharmakirti, but he basically comes right out and says in the Pramanavartika, in the chapter on inference, that conceptual knowledge is controlled by ignorance, and that he even says the sentence, ignorance is defined as conceptuality. So, why? Because he's thinking that perception knows real things, like actual specific things, whereas conceptuality works with made-up stuff that we're, not to say that it's useless, he doesn't say it's useless, but it's always wrong, because it's always working with made-up stuff in the mind, these abstract categories. So, I'll just read this so we can have the association with it. Dharmakirti says, one sees among things some have a common purpose, like taking pictures, and as such are distinguished from other things that don't take pictures. These, by nature, produce a false awareness, which is combined with words that exclude one set of things from the other. Like there's the camera class and the non-camera class. And I call that a camera by way of excluding all the things that don't take pictures. That's actually the way he's thinking about this. And recognizing this is that, this is a camera, the difference between things, all the different particular cameras, is glossed over, is ignored, is, obviated. But why can't conceptual thought apprehend things without glossing over the difference? He asks himself. Because conceptual knowledge is not capable of apprehending particular, which he means in his way of thinking, actual things, because it's controlled by ignorance. Sense awareness, on the other hand, in Dharmakirti's system, is not erroneous. It knows actual things through direct perception, because ignorance is defined as conceptuality. So he's going to leave ignorance out of the whole sense sphere. You see a lot of people who actually still write like this, who say, we just have to stop thinking and get more in touch with our senses, and then we'll all be good. Like the problem, the drink a glass of cold water, sung san. It's like, don't tell me words about the Dharma, just drink cold water. And it's like, to me that conjures up this idea, that we'll find at the level of ordinary direct sense perception a kind of truth that is being concealed by the way in which conceptuality has to work with abstractions. Yeah. So anyway, by throwing that in there, you see that I'm trying to make a line. I don't know that Sung San has been influenced by Dharmakirti directly, but I want to make it clear that I really wasn't trying to say that Zen was Taoism. I feel like it's like overdetermined in a sense. Like I was thinking, it was like, what do I mean? How can we explain overdetermined in a Buddhist way? I was thinking, because we have causes and conditions, and then what if I lit a match to the forest, and at that exact same time, lightning struck? It's like, it could be something like that, or things come together in this case to produce a Zen way of talking about not knowing, a Taoist vocabulary, a Taoist ontology, frankly, a Taoist way of thinking about what's real, and it mixes together with this criticism of conceptual thought that's coming, from some strains of Buddhism. Okay, so I think this is very important, because then you can see why it's going to be really important to not all Buddhists, but almost all Buddhists, to start thinking about Buddha as a person who has no conceptual thought whatsoever. Of course, he makes the point there at the end that doesn't mean that all conceptual thought is bad. This is very important too for Tsongkhapa, that even though he thinks, he's just said ignorance is defined as conceptuality, he says ignorance expresses itself in concepts. It's true, but some of these are necessary on the path. Yeah, you have to use concepts according to Dharmakirti. And he's like, of course, super conceptual, all about logic. I mean, the whole process of reasoning comes from him. So it's so surprising to hear that he himself was defining everything that he did in all of his books as ignorance. Yeah. This quote from Prabhanavartika comes from, I gave the reference there. It's it's the PV means Prabhanavartika. SV refers to the first chapter on inference, 49, and I'm quoting it or ellipsing, taking excerpts from it out of John Dunn's article in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Yeah, it's right where it says 27 on. It's 27, yeah, at the end of that quote. Yeah. So, interesting thing though, before we move on, before we stop for this morning, is that you can see that for this reason, most people after this would start to make models of what what the goal is, what kind of consciousness we're seeking to attain. They don't want to incorporate it into some kind of gross error that, where Buddha's thinking about, abstractions and taking them as though they were real things in the way that conceptual thought gets confused. But then there's the problem of how does Buddha talk? Where does Buddha's speech? If we think, Dharmakirti started with concepts and language, and words are, concepts are working mostly with some kind of language, right? And the words, just like the concepts, are referring to these abstractions. So Dharmakirti had to answer that himself. He couldn't ignore that. And so his position was that Buddha is able to talk, Buddha is able to teach, without actually having any conceptual thought whatsoever, but only by direct perception of other people's conceptions. Yeah, that's what he has to say. Well, and if you think about it, that's probably a reasonable position. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to think the Buddha is omniscient but doesn't have any error, then like to think conceptually would always involve some kind of error, because you're confusing a general thing with a specific thing. And so Buddha would have to have a direct perception that is able to know all conceptual thoughts, but not think them, strangely. But because of the way that that's a little bit uncomfortable, one of his commentators, Vinitadeva, actually comes right out and owns it and says, Buddhas do have concepts. And Jayananda, who we'll come to, who is a commentator on Chandra Kirti, also references, quote, other Buddhists, without naming them, and we don't know who they are, who seem to also accept that Buddhas had concepts. So it wasn't unheard of to say, that Buddhas have concepts, even after Dharmakirti. But most people, like going with the force of what Dharmakirti said, had to go to this non-conceptual Buddha. I've heard, actually, an argument among contemporary Western philosophers of Buddhism about this exact thing, one of whom wants to say that Buddhas have thoughts, and the other who's taking the Dharmakirti line, that this just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, well, what I'm going to be doing next, and is unsuitable to start at this exact moment because is to talk then about Chandra Kirti. So I'll just preview, what the general idea. So we know, maybe you remember that Lama Tsongkhapa was, at least according to the biography version of his life, right? He wasn't born a Buddha. Well, you get some other stories like that later, but basically he was a person who was trying to figure out the view during his lifetime. And he was studied with a lot of different teachers, and he didn't feel that from any of them he had gotten the view and fully, even though he was appreciative of what he learned from them. And he was confronted, as he himself describes, at some length, by this huge mass of Buddhist literature, and not knowing. It's like you have to decide which thing to take as your interpretive key to make sense out of all the rest. So what to pick? This is actually the same problem that many people, in China, for example, some people said, what are we going to do with all this stuff? And some people said, let's take the Lotus Sutra and we'll interpret everything in terms of the Lotus Sutra. Or in Tibet, some people said, well, let's take the Kala Chakra Tantra and we'll interpret everything else in terms of the Kala Chakra. So you pick something and say, this is where we've got the whole story accurately, and everything else we'll understand and read through the lens of this. But what to take, and he was, I think to be honest, he didn't feel that there was was overwhelmingly clear that there was anything that was, exactly, there wasn't any book that he could read and say, oh, that's exactly it. But he was very tempted by Chandra Kirti, right? And so then he meets with this guy, Lama Umapa, who helps him learn how to meet with Manjushri. And Manjushri, he asked Manjushri, can I rely on Chandra Kirti? And Manjushri is reported to have said, how could a stainless one such as that have any fault? In other words, you should go with Chandra Kirti. And it's okay, so now does that mean that he was not going with a popular choice? And as I think I tried to make the point here when I was teaching some years ago, and I was possessed by the spirit of Bhava Viveka briefly, that it would be much more natural, or let me put it this way, it'd be much more obvious for Tsongkhapa, who wants to emphasize conventional valid cognition, to go with a guy like Bhava Viveka, who's balancing emptiness with the sense that things have some real character on their own side conventionally. But he doesn't. Instead, he goes with the person that pretty much everybody, with few exceptions, has been accusing of nihilism And he puts that as the basis for his distinctly anti-nihilistic interpretation of Buddhist philosophy, right? And part of my point is, before we've talked some about how he does that, but this time what I want to do is like go back and say, well, suppose you didn't know Tsongkhapa's Manjushri-aided way of reading Chandrakirti, and you were just like a regular person in the 11th century trying to read Chandrakirti and figure out what he thought. You might arrive at some conclusions that were different from what J. Rinpoche came up with. And those might give you a very different, more not knowing oriented view of what it means to be a Buddha. That's enough for this morning. Thank you.